Galactic Council declared war on Earth, a fatal mistake. The translator bead in my ear was still warm from the morning session, when the Grand Arbiter's voice filled the chamber and stopped my heart. I am Commander HFY Reyes, Earth Defense Council Liaison, and I have sat inside the Galactic Assembly on Velaryon Prime for 6 months without once feeling afraid. Not when the Velhari delegates called us a parasitic species during the open-floor debate. Not when the Asin ambassador submitted a 1,400-page report classifying human emotional behavior as evidence of instability. Not when the Council's intelligence review was leaked to the press, and our entire military development program was described, in the official galactic news feeds, as evidence of a civilization preparing for unprovoked aggression. I had read all of it, absorbed all of it, and none of it had frightened me, because I had been briefed before I arrived on what the likely outcome of this process was. The possibility of fear had been replaced, a long time ago, by the particular stillness of someone who has already accepted the worst and is simply waiting for it to arrive. Until now. The hall is enormous. It was built to seat representatives from over 1,000 species, and the ceiling is so high that the upper galleries dissolve into artificial cloud. The walls are pale and seamless, lit from within, and the acoustics are so perfect that a whisper from any seat can be heard anywhere in the room if the speaker points it right. Every seat is filled. The air smells like burnt copper, and something sweet I have never been able to name. A combination of thousands of different atmospheric requirements processed through the building's environmental systems into something theoretically breathable for all. Every pair of eyes in that room is on me, compound eyes and single-lens eyes and lidless eyes, and eyes that glow from behind dark membranes. And they are all watching me the way you watch something that is about to become a historical footnote. I am the only human in the room. I have been the only human in this room for 6 months. The Grand Arbiter is a tall creature, narrow and pale, with 4 arms that fold against its chest when it speaks and unfold when it wants to emphasize a point. It has been the Grand Arbiter for longer than my country has had a written constitution. It stands at the center podium and reads from a glowing document suspended in the air before it, and its voice is calm. It always sounds calm. The Council's leadership are selected partly for that quality. A voice that does not change no matter what it is saying. That is the part that makes it terrifying. The Galactic Council, in full session, has reviewed the case of the species designated humanity, originating from the 3rd planet of the star system catalogued Sol, commonly referred to as Earth. Following a review period of 14 standard cycles, this body concludes that humanity represents a Class Omega developmental threat. The criteria are met in full. The species demonstrates accelerated technological progression at a rate exceeding established safety thresholds, has engaged in sustained internal armed conflict throughout its documented history, has demonstrated the capacity for cross-territorial and cross-planetary military operation, and has shown no meaningful evidence of behavioral stabilization consistent with peaceful integration into the galactic community. The vote proceeds. Class Omega. I had read that term in briefing files so many times that it had stopped feeling real, a bureaucratic phrase, a category in a document. Now it hung in the air above me like a verdict being handed down by a court that had decided the outcome before the first hearing, and I understood for the first time what it must have felt like for the 11 other species who had heard it said in this same chamber. The Velhari, the Asi Collective, the Dramath. The others whose names I had memorized during my preparation, because I believed it was important to know the names of the ones who came before and were not saved. The voting was public. Every council member's decision appeared on the massive display wall in colored light, green for approval of the declaration, red for rejection. I watched the green lights fill the board like a slow tide moving up a shore. Species I had worked beside for half a year, shared meals with, exchanged cultural and scientific data with, argued with in the corridors during recesses. all of them pressing the same button, all of them adding their light to a board that was telling me, and everyone watching, that my planet was to be suppressed. Species I had genuinely respected. Species whose cultures contained beauty and depth and centuries of accumulated wisdom. All of them voting yes, because their doctrine told them that a species like mine was a risk, and their doctrine had been correct before, and so they trusted it again. The final count appeared on the board, 217 in favor, 1 against. Earth's proxy vote, cast by me, standing alone in a single column of red on a wall of green. The chamber erupted in sound, not celebration, something more complicated than that. The kind of collective exhale that a large room makes when a thing they have been building toward has finally arrived. They were not happy about this. Most of them, I believe, were not happy about it. But they had made their decision, and now it was done, and the sound was simply the release of the tension of making it. The Grand Arbiter raised one thin arm. The sound stopped. Commander Reyes, the Council extends the courtesy of final remarks. You have 4 minutes. I stood. My chair scraped against the floor and the sound echoed in the perfect acoustics of the room. I straightened the collar of my uniform, navy blue, Earth's crest on the left shoulder, a single gold bar on each sleeve, and I looked out at 217 species who had just voted to authorize the suppression of my world. I was not angry. I want to be honest about that. I had prepared for this moment for 3 years, not in an abstract way, in a very specific way, with written notes and rehearsed statements and a deep familiarity with the Council's protocols for final remarks, and exactly how much could be communicated in 4 minutes speaking at a measured pace. Anger was not something I had prepared for, because anger was not useful here. What I felt was something closer to certainty. The kind of deep, settled certainty that comes when a long and complicated calculation finally resolves, and the number on the page is exactly what you always expected it to be. Members of the Council, I said, and my voice carried clean through the chamber's broadcast system. I want to thank this body for the courtesy of these 4 minutes. I will use them honestly. A few delegates shifted in their seats. I could see it happening across the hall, the small adjustments of beings who had expected a plea, an appeal to mercy, a final argument for reconsideration. That was what every species before us had done, according to the historical records I had studied at length. The Velhari had wept. The Aussie Collective had presented their entire civilizational philosophy as evidence of peaceful intent. The Dramath had offered their scientific archive as a gesture of goodwill, and asked only to be observed for another generation before any action was taken. All of them had been suppressed anyway. I'm not here to ask this council to reverse its decision, I continued. The vote is recorded, and I accept it as the official position of this body. What I want to do instead is make a clear statement on behalf of the 8 billion people I represent, for the permanent historical record, so that whatever follows this moment is properly documented and properly understood by any future body that examines these events. The Grand Arbiter gave a small nod. My 4 minutes were running. Earth has been aware of this body's deliberation since the review process began 14 standard cycles ago. We have monitored the proceedings through channels this council believed were secure. We have read every internal report, every threat assessment, every proposed suppression timeline. We know the operational plan in detail. We know the fleet composition, the target coordinates, the expected campaign duration, and the escalation thresholds at which each phase activates. The chamber had gone completely quiet. Several delegates were very still in a way that was not natural stillness. The Talvath ambassador, 12 rows back and to my left, had stopped mid-movement with a data tablet raised halfway to its face. I imagined the internal experience was similar to what a human would call frozen. We did not attempt to interrupt this process or expose our access to these materials, because we needed to know the final outcome before we acted. We needed to know whether this council would find another path, or whether it would follow its doctrine to the end. Now we know. And so I am transmitting one word to Earth in the time remaining to me before your jamming protocols activate. I pressed the communicator on my wrist. The Council's security system would identify the signal and shut it down within seconds. That was standard procedure. They had protocols for exactly this moment, for the possibility that a final statement might become a call for military preparation. But I had designed the transmission to be compressed to a single coded burst. I only needed a fraction of a second. The word was already formatted, compressed, and queued. I sent it. Saber. Two guards moved toward me immediately from the side entrances. They were large, insect-bodied beings in the silver armor of the Council's security detail, and they were fast. I did not resist. I put my hands at my sides and let them take hold of my arms, and as they did I completed my statement, speaking quickly but clearly. The Galactic Council has declared war on Earth. I want this body to understand, for the permanent record, that this is not the first time a powerful institution has made this precise mistake. It will, however, be the last time this particular institution makes it. We are ready. We have been ready for a very long time. I want to thank the Council for confirming what we needed to know. They walked me out of the chamber. The great doors closed behind me with a sound like a mountain settling. I was taken through 2 corridors and placed in a holding room, clean, a cot, a window that looked out onto Valarian's pale late afternoon sky, soft amber and deep blue at the same time. A guard stood outside, the lock engaged. I sat down on the edge of the cot, folded my hands in my lap, and allowed myself one small smile that no one was there to see. The word had been sent. One word, transmitted in a fraction of a second, and on the other side of 47 light minutes of space, an entire architecture of preparation that had taken 3 generations of strategists to build was now unlocked and running. 8 billion people were moving according to a plan so precise and so detailed that it had accounted for this exact moment, for me sitting in this holding room, alone, while the Council fleet received its activation orders and began moving toward my home. They thought they had just sentenced a primitive world to suppression. They had no understanding of what they had actually started. Outside the window, Valarian sky was turning the color of cooling metal, beautiful and completely indifferent to the fact that somewhere in the dark between stars, 800 warships were already calculating their approach vectors to a planet that had been waiting for them for 40 years. Let them come. We had spent every one of those years getting ready. Dr. Yusuf Akafer had not slept in 31 hours, and he looked exactly like someone who had not slept in 31 hours, and he had long ago stopped caring about that. He was standing at the primary display console in Earth's strategic war room, deep beneath the surface of the Sahara Desert, inside a facility that did not officially exist and had not officially existed since the day construction began 26 years ago. The room was enormous, 3 operational levels connected by open staircases, curved walls covered floor to ceiling in displays, a central briefing table large enough to seat 40 people and currently occupied by 26 of the most important human beings alive: generals, intelligence directors, the Secretary of Earth Defense, the heads of the 3 primary research divisions, the chief of the Thornwall program. 40 years of preparation had produced this room and these people in this moment, and Yusuf, who had contributed more to the theoretical framework of that preparation than almost anyone, was standing at the console and doing the thing he had done in every briefing and simulation for the past decade, explaining, clearly and without drama, exactly what was about to happen and why. The primary display showed the solar system in 3 dimensions, rendered in pale blue light. At the far edge of the projection, just past Jupiter's orbital path, a cluster of 800 small red markers moved slowly inward. Each marker represented a ship. Each ship was between 4 and 12 times the size of Earth's largest carrier. They had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at Jupiter's L2.36 hours ago, precisely the position Yusuf's models had predicted, and they had issued their ultimatum within the first 2 hours of arrival. Stand down all military activity, surrender planetary governance to Council administration, or face what the Council's official transmission called corrective orbital engagement. Bombardment. Yusuf had the transmission transcript on the secondary display to his right. He had read it 4 times. It was, professionally speaking, an excellent document. Clear, precise, authoritative, with just enough specific technical language to signal that the threat was not rhetorical. The Council knew how to write an ultimatum. They had written versions of this same document 11 times before. "Here is where we are," Yusuf said to the room. His voice was the same as it always was, measured, clear, carrying without effort. He had been told throughout his career that his voice was his greatest professional asset. He sounded calm even in situations that were not calm, and in this particular room with this particular audience, that quality mattered. The Council fleet has positioned itself in a standard containment formation, which matches their documented doctrine for Class Omega suppression operations exactly. They have given us 72 hours. Their intention is to use that time to conduct sensor sweeps, finalize target coordinates, and allow their bombardment systems to reach optimal operational temperature. "They are not expecting us to use those hours productively," said General Marcus Webb, seated at the head of the table, his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on the display. "Correct," Yusuf agreed. "Their historical data on Class Omega responses suggests that subject species spend the final 72 hours in one of 3 patterns: continued resistance preparation, which their models account for; civilian evacuation attempts, which their bombardment doctrine is specifically designed to make irrelevant; or surrender negotiations, which their protocols handle automatically. They are prepared for all 3. They are not prepared for what we have actually been doing for the past 9 years." He brought up the next display. It showed a timeline stretching across 14,000 years. "The Galactic Council has been the dominant military power in this region of the galaxy since before our recorded history. In that time, they have conducted 247 suppression campaigns. They have never lost one. That record is real, it is documented, and it deserves genuine respect. It also represents the single most significant strategic vulnerability in galactic military history." General Webb looked up from his notes. "Explain that." "When you have never lost, you stop designing for the possibility of losing. Not consciously, no one at the Council's strategic command sat down and decided to stop preparing for failure. It happens gradually, through the accumulation of successful outcomes. Your doctrine becomes refined around what works, because what works always works. Your training systems optimize for the enemy behaviors you have observed, because those behaviors have always appeared. Your threat assessment models are built on 14,000 years of data that all points in the same direction. Your doctrine becomes extraordinarily good at one very specific kind of war, and it loses the flexibility to adapt to anything outside that pattern." He moved to the timeline display and highlighted a recurring shape, the arc of every suppression campaign in the record, the same curve repeated 247 times. Initial contact, designation review, declaration, fleet deployment, ultimatum, resistance phase, escalation, morale collapse, surrender. Every campaign follows this arc. There are variations in timing and in the specific character of the resistance, but the shape is always the same. Resistance weakens over time. Losses accumulate. The subject species reaches a threshold beyond which continued resistance seems irrational and surrender becomes the logical choice. The Council applies pressure until that threshold is crossed. They are genuinely exceptional at this. Their understanding of how to find and reach that threshold, in species after species across 14,000 years, is among the most refined operational capabilities in galactic military history. He turned to face the room. Here is the gap. Here is the place where 14,000 years of perfect victories has produced a doctrine with one blind spot, so large it is almost difficult to see precisely because it is everywhere. He pulled up a new display, a single graph, a curve that bent downward under pressure, the resistance decay function that appeared in every Council War model, and beside it a second curve, one that bent upward under the same conditions. The Council's doctrine assumes that resistance is a finite resource, that it depletes under sustained pressure, that the threshold exists and can be reached by applying enough force for long enough. That is correct for every species they have ever engaged. It is not correct for us. He pointed to the rising curve. I have spent 30 years studying human responses to existential threat, not theoretical responses, documented, historical, measurable responses drawn from every major conflict in our recorded history. What the data shows, consistently and without exception, is that human resistance does not decrease under sustained pressure. It increases. We become more creative under stress, not less. We become more willing to accept risk when the situation is worst, not when it is stable. Our greatest technological innovations, our most significant strategic breakthroughs, our most effective collective actions as a species have occurred specifically during the periods of greatest external threat. We have a documented and repeatable pattern of producing exactly what we need most precisely when we are closest to losing everything. General Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair and looked at the two curves on the display. And their models do not account for this pattern. Their models cannot account for it. The data does not exist in their system because they have never fought a species that demonstrated it. Every species they have encountered has followed the standard decay curve. We are, as far as the galactic record currently shows, the only species in documented history whose resistance function trends upward under pressure rather than downward. They have no variable for it. They have no counter-doctrine for it. And by the time they recognize it is happening, they will already be too far into the campaign to adapt. Carol Finch, the Secretary of Earth Defense, was a small woman with short gray hair and the absolutely steady focus of someone who had been preparing for this specific conversation for over a decade. She spoke without raising her voice. "Tell them about Thornwall." Yusuf nodded. He changed the display. The solar system again, but this time overlaid with a dense field of small white dots scattered throughout the asteroid belt. Thousands of them. From a distance, the display looked like it was showing natural debris patterns. That was the point. Project Thornwall has been in development for 19 years and in active deployment for the last 9. 40,000 autonomous strike drones, each approximately the size of a standard cargo transport container, positioned throughout the asteroid belt in a pattern designed to maximize coverage of the approaches from Jupiter's orbital path inward. Power source is compressed mass reactor technology, which produces no heat signature and no radiation bloom detectable by any sensor system currently in the Council's inventory. The drones were manufactured using composite materials specifically engineered to match the spectral signature of common silicate asteroid rock. Their communication protocols are designed to produce no electromagnetic output during dormant phase. He let the room look at the display. To every sensor array aboard every ship in the Council's fleet, they are rocks. They have been rocks for 9 years. The Council fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and positioned itself directly in the middle of 40,000 autonomous weapons platforms, and their sensors told them they were parked beside a normal asteroid field. The room was very quiet. A young intelligence analyst named Paul Garrett, attending his first full War Council briefing, leaned slightly forward. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were doing the thing eyes do when a person encounters a number that takes a moment to resolve. Has the Council detected any of them? No, we had 3 near-detection events in the early deployment phase when our spacing protocol was not fully optimized. We adjusted after each one. The last near-detection was 6 years ago. Since then, nothing. Yusuf paused for exactly 1 second. The Council fleet is currently sitting in the densest section of the deployment field. They do not know this. He advanced the display. The white dots in the asteroid belt began to glow, all 40,000 highlighted in soft gold, surrounding the fleet positions in a field that looked, now that it was revealed, less like a debris field and more like a net. When Thornwall activates, the drones do not target hull integrity. They are not designed to destroy ships. They are designed to target specific systems, drive couplings, communication relay nodes, sensor array housings, and weapons targeting computers. The goal is not to destroy the fleet. The goal is to make the fleet unable to coordinate reliably, navigate with precision, or maintain communication with its own command structure. A blind and deaf fleet, Carol Finch said. A blind and deaf fleet, Yusuf confirmed. 800 warships that cannot reach each other reliably. Captains making decisions without orders, without accurate situational awareness, and without confidence in their own sensor data. In any military force, that condition produces exactly one outcome over time: the disintegration of coordinated action. Individual ships are still dangerous. The fleet, as a unified instrument, stops functioning. General Webb stood up and walked to the display. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with the physical bearing of someone who had spent his career in rooms where presence mattered. He studied the fleet positions surrounded by the glowing drone field for a long moment, then looked at Yusuf. The 72 hours, 3 things. 3 things, Yusuf confirmed. First, completion of civilian transition to the Deep Earth Habitat Network. As of this morning, we are at 94%. Full completion is projected at 60 hours, giving us 12 hours of margin before the ultimatum window closes. Second, final activation of the thermal signature units in the evacuated population centers. These systems replicate the heat output, electronic activity patterns, and movement signatures of functioning cities. From orbit, using the Council's current sensor technology, they register as occupied. Every city will appear lived, in up to and including the moment it is struck. Admiral Linda Cross, commander of Earth's carrier fleet, had the steady composure of someone who had flown combat operations on 3 different planets, and understood that decisions made in rooms like this one had consequences that outran the room itself. So when they strike the cities, they are striking empty buildings. Empty buildings filled with carefully calibrated systems that respond to impact precisely the way an occupied city responds. Their sensors will record what their models predict: mass impact, structural collapse signatures, heat bloom consistent with a successful strike on a populated target. Their battle assessment computers will generate damage reports. Their commander will begin composing his mission summary to the Grand Arbiter. He changed the display one final time. The solar system again, but now with a different overlay, not Thornwall, but a network of nodes scattered across the outer system. Supply depots, communication relays, jump coordinate calibration stations, resupply platforms. The Council's logistical infrastructure, mapped in precise detail over 4 years of patient intelligence work. The Council expected this campaign to last between 40 and 90 standard days. They planned accordingly. Every supply relay, every logistics node, every fuel depot and communication satellite they pre-positioned in our solar system has been mapped. We have strike teams already deployed in the outer system, using the same spectral masking technology as the Thornwall drones. They have been in position for 3 months. They are waiting for the activation order. Paul Garrett said quietly, "The third thing." "The third thing," Yusuf said. "While the Council believes we are spending these 72 hours in panic or surrender negotiation, we are removing their ability to sustain a long campaign. Their fleet can fight. Without its logistics network, it cannot resupply. Without resupply." A campaign designed to last 90 days can sustain perhaps 14 before facing serious resource constraints. We are not trying to outfight them. We are trying to outlast them. And a fleet that cannot resupply cannot outlast anything. He turned off the main display. The room settled into the particular quiet of people who have just understood the full shape of a plan that has been in motion for a very long time. The Council has 800 warships and a 14,000-year record of success. It is moving toward our planet on a timeline built on 247 successful precedents. It has assessed us as a Class Omega threat, and it knows, correctly, that its fleet is more powerful than anything we can field in direct confrontation. He picked up his water glass, drank slowly, set it down. What it does not know is that we are not planning a direct confrontation. We are not fighting their fleet. We are fighting their assumptions. We are fighting their doctrine. We are fighting the deep, accumulated certainty of a force that has never lost, directed at an enemy that has spent 40 years studying exactly what that certainty costs. He looked around the room at 26 people who had given decades of their lives to this preparation. They made one fundamental error. Not about our weapons, not about our numbers, not about anything visible on their sensors. They made it the moment they looked at our planet and decided that because we were young and small and loud and chaotic, we were predictable. That because we had never fought them before, we had never thought about them. He closed his briefing file. We have been thinking about nothing else for 40 years. They are about to find out what that preparation looks like from the inside of it. Outside, beneath 40 meters of Saharan bedrock and reinforced steel, the world above was quiet. In the cities, the streets were empty. The thermal units hummed their steady rhythms. The electronic signatures cycled through their normal patterns. From space, Earth looked exactly like a populated planet going about its frightened, ordinary business under the shadow of an approaching fleet. It was the most elaborate deception in the history of any species the Council had ever encountered. And it was only the beginning. Lieutenant Claire Madden had exactly 90 seconds before her approach window closed, and she had to abort the run. She was not going to abort the run. Her fighter, designation Vanguard 6, a modified Earth strike configuration with a hardened payload bay currently carrying 4 resonance charge packages, was running completely dark at 2,000 kilometers per second through the gap between the Council fleet's 2nd and 3rd defensive patrol rings. No active radar. No outbound communication signals of any kind. Navigation running entirely on preloaded positional data updated 30 seconds ago from a passive relay node, and on the kind of instinct that only develops in pilots who have spent years in situations where a single wrong input makes the distinction between landing and not landing permanent. Claire Madden was 28 years old and she had been flying since she was 15. Cargo routes first, over the flooded North Sea corridor, carrying humanitarian supplies to the communities that the sea walls had not saved in time. Military induction at 19. Combat certification at 21. 2 tour in the Mars Patrol Division, managing cargo lines through the dust storm corridors that could blind navigation systems and strip hull coatings in the same sequence. And then the program, the one that nobody outside the top tier of Earth Defense Command knew existed, that had found the 47 best combat pilots currently flying for any branch of Earth's military, and spent 2 years converting them into something the Council's entire strategic catalog had no entry for. Vanguard Squadron. 12 fighters, 12 pilots, a mission built on such precise timing and such complete dependence on every preceding element going right simultaneously that they had run simulations of it 430 times over the past 18 months. Claire had flown it so often that she replayed it behind her eyes when she was trying to sleep. The approach vector, the ring gap, the hull profile of the flagship appearing in the cockpit display, the charge placement sequence, the exit burn. She had failed the simulation 63 times across all those runs. Each failure had been different. Each had taught her something that made the next run more precise. Now it was real. The main difference she noticed was that the hull she was approaching did not have the slightly soft edges of a rendered simulation. It was solid. It was enormous. It occupied the forward half of her cockpit view like a structure that someone had decided to build between the stars. The Council's flagship was called the Eternal Arbiter. 2 kilometers of compressed alloy and weapon systems shaped like a flattened oval, with 4 massive drive columns extending from its rear section and weapons platforms running along both equatorial ridges. By any technical standard, it was among the most capable warships ever constructed in the galactic record. Claire had spent more hours studying its schematics than she had spent sleeping in the month before this mission. She knew its layout with the precision of someone who had made it personal. She knew specifically that the tertiary hull section, the lower rear quarter, sitting in the sensor shadow cast by the main drive column, housed a backup communications array powerful enough to broadcast simultaneously to every ship in the fleet. A redundant system, kept in standby, designed to activate automatically if primary communications failed. Primary communications across the Council fleet had been compromised for 16 hours. Thornwall had seen to that. The tertiary array was now the fleet's primary broadcast backbone, carrying the fleet commander's orders to every ship that could still receive them. Claire was about to turn that array into something else entirely. Vanguard 6 to Vanguard lead. On approach, gap is holding 40 seconds. Vanguard lead confirms. All units check in. Squadron Commander Peter Hale's voice was barely above noise level on the tight beam, something between a whisper and a signal. He was ahead and to her left, invisible in the dark. 11 confirmations came back rapid and clean. 12 ships had entered the gap. 12 pilots were threading through the space between 2 patrol rings, whose coordination had begun to slip the moment Thornwall fragmented the fleet's communication architecture. The gap had appeared exactly when the models said it would. Without updated orders, individual patrol captains had defaulted to their last known assignments. The rotation had drifted. A window had opened between the rings, 30 seconds wide at its widest point, just large enough for 12 fighters running dark to pass through without triggering an automated proximity response. They had been waiting 9 days for that window. The Council fleet had initiated its bombardment operation on day 7, 6 days after the ultimatum expired without surrender from Earth. The thermal signature units had done their work precisely. Council sensors recorded strike impacts and heat blooms, and the data signatures consistent with significant damage to occupied population centers. Their battle computers generated assessments. The reports going back to the Grand Arbiter described a campaign proceeding according to doctrine. On day 9, with the fleet consolidating for what its commanders expected to be the decisive second bombardment phase, Thornwall had activated. Claire had watched it from the carrier. One moment the tactical display showed the asteroid belt as a standard field of debris contacts. The next, 40,000 new objects had switched from dormant to active in the same second, drive systems coming online, targeting systems engaging, the entire prepared field going from passive to operational in a coordinated instant that the Council's sensors had no precedent for. The effect on the fleet was not the dramatic exchange of a conventional engagement. It was quieter and somehow more unsettling. Ships losing drive coordination as drones found their propulsion couplings. Communications arrays going dark across more than 200 ships in the first 4 minutes. Sensor packages burning out as resonance charges found their housings and detonated. The fleet did not break. It stumbled. It lost the coordination that made 800 ships into a single instrument, and a fleet that loses that coordination while maintaining a bombardment posture is a fleet that is suddenly operating on individual instinct rather than unified doctrine. According to the signal intercepts Claire's passive arrays had been collecting, the fleet's captains were doing exactly what individual commanders do when the orders stop, and the situation changes faster than their protocols account for, improvising differently from each other. 38 ships in the outer formation had already broken their assigned positions and pulled back to Neptune's orbital range on day 8. They had done it without orders, without coordination with other ships, each captain making the individual calculation that their damaged sensor data, their compromised communications, and the general uncertainty of a situation that had clearly departed from the operational plan made pulling back to a defensible position the reasonable choice. That mattered, not because 38 ships changed the military balance of a fleet of 800. They did not. It mattered because it showed that the fleet's discipline was contingent on its communications. When the orders stopped arriving reliably, the behavior stopped being uniform. And uniform behavior, Claire had learned from 2 years of intensive study of the Council's operational history, was the foundation on which their entire doctrine rested. Without it, they were 800 individual ships with individual captains making individual decisions. Powerful still, but no longer a single instrument. 10 seconds, Hale said. Claire confirmed her payload configuration. 4 resonance charge packages, each the size of a large equipment case, magnetically bonded to the release rails, transmitter housing presynced to the tertiary array's broadcast frequency, so that establishment of hull contact would complete the connection. 5. The tertiary hull filled her cockpit view completely. At this range, she could read the surface detail, maintenance access panels, the scoring of years of drive exhaust and interstellar particle impact, antenna housing brackets aligned in precise rows. Real, solid, the command ship of the fleet that had come to end her planet. Mark. She released all 4 packages in a single continuous pass. The magnetic clamps engaged with 4 soft impacts she felt through her ship's frame. She pulled up immediately, maximum climb angle, full drive output on the exit vector, the fighter's nose rising as she drove away from the hull's surface and turned hard for the exit corridor. 11 other pilots were executing the same sequence along different sections of the same hull. 12 ships entering the gap, 12 ships placing their payload, 12 ships burning back out. The entire operation lasted less than 90 seconds from first entry to last exit. All units clear, Hale reported. Payload confirm. 12 confirmations. Claire held her exit burn for 30 more seconds, creating distance. Then she cut drive, went passive, and let herself breathe for a moment. Her hands, as always, had not shaken. Back on the carrier, the communications team spent 4 minutes interfacing with the charges through their relay signal and pushing the prepared broadcast package. When it went out, it used the flagship's own tertiary array, authenticated in the Council's own broadcast format, appearing on every ship in the fleet as an emergency order originating from the Eternal Arbiter itself. Every display on every Council ship in the solar system showed the same text. You have entered a prepared defensive system. Your communications have been compromised. Your drive systems have been selectively targeted. Your logistics infrastructure throughout this solar system has been neutralized. You have not been destroyed because we chose not to destroy you. We are making that choice again now. Withdraw your fleet beyond the outer marker of this system within 24 hours. This offer will not be extended. Signed, Earth Defense Command. No speech, no appeal, no anger, precise information with a clear timeline and one specific required action. Claire was told later that 38 additional ships broke their formation positions within 14 minutes of receiving that message. Added to the original 38, that was 76 ships no longer in assigned formation, their captains having read the message, assessed their compromised sensor data and partially functional drive systems, and concluded that pulling back was the reasonable response to a situation that had clearly moved beyond the parameters of the plan they had been given. The remaining ships held. The fleet did not collapse, but a fleet from which 76 ships have independently broken formation, without orders, is not the same fleet that arrived with complete confidence 3 weeks prior. Something had entered the system that had not been there before. Doubt not in their weapons, in the situation, in whether what they were operating inside of was actually what their doctrine said it was. That was enough. Claire landed on the carrier deck, powered down, and sat for a moment in the silence of her cockpit before popping the canopy. The crew chief walked toward her with a clipboard and an expression that was working very hard to stay professional. "Charges held," she said as she dropped to the deck. "Confirmed. Broadcast delivered. Admiral Cross wants the squadron in debrief in 40 minutes. Tell the Admiral 35. She pulled off her flight gloves and walked toward the debrief room, and she thought about the Council Admiral somewhere out in the dark, sitting in his command room aboard a partially compromised flagship, reading a message delivered through his own broadcast system by an enemy that had just demonstrated, without any ambiguity, that the operational reality around him was not what his doctrine had prepared him for. She knew what that moment felt like when the plan stops matching the ground. She had been in enough difficult situations to recognize it. She hoped he was skilled enough to respond correctly. She suspected he was, which was exactly why what came next was going to be hard. General Marcus Webb had a habit of tapping a pen against the edge of his left knee when he was working through a difficult problem, not nervously, rhythmically, a metronome keeping the tempo of his own thinking. He was tapping now. Day 12. The war room was quieter than it had been in the first week. Thornwall had activated on schedule and performed above its projected parameters. The Vanguard Squadron operation had succeeded without a single casualty. The logistics strikes on the Council's outer system supply chain had been completed by day 10, with 17 of the 19 targeted nodes neutralized. The fleet that had arrived with absolute confidence and a flawless historical record was now partially blind, partially deaf, and operating without the logistical backbone that had been designed to sustain a 90-day campaign. By every measurable metric, the plan was working. And now Admiral Sekvaz had made a decision. Webb had the intercept on the display in front of him. He had read it twice. He did not need to read it a third time. The Council Admiral, faced with a fleet that was no longer functioning as a unified instrument, denied the clean progression that his doctrine required, and running on a logistical timeline that was now drastically shortened, had authorized the option that his doctrine reserved for exactly this situation. Total bombardment. Not targeted, not graduated, total. Every identified population center struck simultaneously using the fleet's full available bombardment capacity, designed to end the campaign by removing the question of resistance entirely in a single operation. The Council's internal designation for this was resolute enforcement. In operational terms, it meant an overwhelming simultaneous strike at a scale that left no possibility of organized response from the target world. It was the option Sekvaz had been authorized to use from the beginning. He had held it back for 11 days because his doctrine preferred the graduated approach, more precise, cleaner in its outcomes, producing less collateral complexity in the political record. But the graduated approach required a functioning, coordinated fleet, and the fleet he had now was neither of those things. So he had turned to the only remaining option on his list. Webb had a genuine, uncomplicated respect for Sekvaz, not as an ally, not sentimentally, as a professional recognition of another professional. The Council Admiral had done everything his doctrine offered him. He had adapted when Thornwall activated. He had restructured his communication protocols. He had recalled his dispersed ships and reorganized his formation. He had not panicked, had not overreacted, had not made the kind of compounding mistakes that bad commanders make under pressure. He had simply run out of moves inside a doctrine that had never been designed for this situation. His repositioning to low orbital altitude will be complete in 17 hours, Yusuf said from the main display, based on current movement rates. Habitat completion status, Webb said. Carol Finch checked her station. 99.8%. The final transit groups are moving now. Full completion estimated in 9 hours. 8 hours of margin. 8 hours confirmed. Webb set his pen down. He looked at the display where 800 red markers were drifting slowly toward the orbital bands of a planet that, to every sensor they carried, looked fully occupied and vulnerable. He thought about the Deep Earth Habitat Network. 28 years of construction. The most expensive single project in human history, built in pieces, described in public documentation as geological research infrastructure and emergency preparedness facilities. Its true scale and purpose known only to the people who built it and the people who were now inside it. 240 kilometers of pressurized corridor connecting sealed habitat modules distributed across 6 continents and 5 underwater sites. Food production, water recycling, medical capacity, power generation sufficient for 18 months of full occupancy. 8 billion people. They were not comfortable. The design had never aimed at comfort. The design aim was survivable and functional. Families shared rooms intended for 2 people. Common areas served as sleeping space. In the transit corridors connecting the larger modules, people moved in organized columns guided by habitat management teams that had been trained specifically for this transition. It was not easy. It was not pleasant. But it was working. And it was working because 3 generations of planners had spent 40 years making sure it would work when it was needed. Webb had done his final walkthrough 3 months before. 4 hours in the corridors, stopping to talk to people, looking at what 4 decades of preparation had actually produced when it was full of real people living inside it. He had talked to a man named George Ellison, a farmer from the English countryside, broad-shouldered, unhurried, with soil still under his fingernails from the last day he had worked his land. George had looked at Webb with the straightforward steadiness of someone who has committed to a thing fully and is not going to second-guess it. "We are trusting you, General," he had said, not as a demand, as a statement of fact offered cleanly, the way you offer a fact that you have decided you are at peace with. Webb had thought about that moment every day since the plan went active. "The thermal signature units are ready," Carol Finch said. "All 23 city packages confirmed active. Strike response protocols are loaded and waiting for impact detection." The thermal signature units were, from a technical standpoint, the most sophisticated component of the deception architecture. Each evacuated city had been equipped with a network of heat-emitting structures, electronic activity generators, and movement simulation systems calibrated to respond to bombardment impact with precisely the signatures that Council battle assessment computers expected to see when a populated target was successfully struck. Heat bloom consistent with structural collapse, cascade failure patterns in the electronic infrastructure, casualty-consistent energy readings. The Council's ships would strike the cities. Their sensors would record impact consistent with a successful operation. Their battle computers would generate damage assessments and victory metrics. Their commander would compose a mission report. And meanwhile, 8 billion people would be sitting in the dark underground, unharmed, connected to each other, and to the broadcasting infrastructure that was the actual purpose the entire deception had been built to serve. "The broadcast package," Webb said, "final readiness status." Corinne Aldridge, the communications division head who had spent 2 years preparing this particular transmission, looked up from her station. She was a quiet woman who gave precise answers. "Ready to transmit on your authorization. All habitat cameras are confirmed active. Aggregate feed is formatted for Galactic Broadcast Standard. Transmission will reach neutral galactic monitoring bands within 40 seconds of activation. Council fleet communication channel penetration within 90 seconds. Verification data is embedded in the transmission header. Population registry records, medical biometrics from the habitat health monitoring systems, real-time confirmation of location and status for every individual currently in the network. Anyone who receives the broadcast and runs a verification check gets confirmation that 8 billion living people are in a confirmed underground location, alive and unharmed, at the time the broadcast is transmitting. Yes. Webb nodded once. We transmit the moment the Council's battle assessment computers complete their analysis of the strike, not during, not before, after their commander has the data and has composed his preliminary report to the Grand Arbiter. Yusuf understood immediately, because the timing determines what it means. If we transmit while the bombardment is still in progress, it reads as a response to attack. If we transmit 4 hours after the Council has formally declared the operation successful and sent that declaration to their leadership, it reads as proof that they declared success over a deception they failed to detect, that their intelligence was insufficient, that their bombardment struck 0 actual civilians despite being specifically authorized on the grounds that civilian targets were present and could not be protected. In front of the entire watching galaxy, Carol Finch said. In front of everyone, Webb looked at the display. The Council declared war on Earth in a public session of the Assembly. The bombardment will be a public military action. The reveal will be equally public. And the question it puts in front of every watching species is not a military question at all. It is a political one, an institutional one. He was quiet for a moment. If you authorize the suppression of a populated world and the world's entire population successfully evacuated underground without your intelligence detecting it, and then prove their survival to the entire galaxy in real time after you had already declared victory, what does that tell every watching species about your judgment, about the process by which this institution makes decisions with civilizational consequences? The room was very quiet. That is the wound that does not close with a second strike. That is the wound that spreads through councils and assemblies and diplomatic back channels, and eventually through public discourse on the council member worlds themselves. They did not just fail militarily. They failed visibly, in front of an audience they cannot influence or control. He looked around at the 26 people in the room. Yusuf, the allied species situation. Yusuf pulled up the final element, a network map, 22 nodes, each representing a species with assembly representation. Species that had voted for Earth's designation, most of them, because the internal politics of the Council's power structure had given them no meaningful alternative. Species with their own histories, their own grievances, their own records of being underrepresented, overlooked, or actively disadvantaged by the way the Council operated, and their own judgments, formed over years of quiet conversations with Earth's diplomatic teams, about whether this was the moment when that structure was sufficiently destabilized to change. All 22 are prepared to move the moment the broadcast lands, Yusuf said. Resolution packages are finalized. Vote sequencing is coordinated. We project 151 to 163 votes for the directorate seat motion, depending on how 3 undecided delegations respond to the broadcast itself. The bombardment came 17 hours and 22 minutes later. It was executed with the precision of a force that had performed the same operation 247 times. 23 targets struck simultaneously in under 4 minutes. The thermal units responded exactly as designed. Heat bloom, structural collapse signatures, electronic cascade failures, casualty-consistent energy patterns. The Council's battle assessment computers processed the data for 3 hours and 38 minutes and generated their report. Campaign objective achieved. Civilian infrastructure eliminated. Organized resistance capability suppressed. Sekvaz transmitted his preliminary report to the Grand Arbiter with the standard 4-hour light delay. Karen Aldridge activated the broadcast 6 minutes after the battle assessment computers completed their analysis. The transmission propagated through Earth's relay network, reached the neutral galactic monitoring bands, and began penetrating Council fleet communication channels within 88 seconds, 2 seconds inside the projected window. Every habitat camera came online simultaneously. The feed showed corridors and modules and common spaces and individual rooms, unbroken across the entire network, 6 continents and 5 ocean floors. People sitting, talking, eating meals from dried supplies, reading to children, playing cards, looking up at cameras that had just come active and understanding in that moment what it meant. 8 billion faces. Alive. The broadcast reached the galactic monitoring bands, and within 40 minutes, the first 3 Council member species had opened emergency diplomatic channels to Earth. Within 2 hours, 7 neutral species had issued formal statements. The Grand Arbiter received HFY's victory report, and the Earth broadcast within 11 minutes of each other, and called an emergency session within the hour. On the tactical display in the war room, the fleet markers stopped their advance. Then, slowly, they began to reverse. HFY had requested his recall authorization. The fleet that had arrived at the edge of the solar system with a perfect record and absolute confidence began the long process of turning back toward the outer system. Webb looked at the display for a long moment. He picked up his pen. He did not tap it. He turned it in his fingers once and then put it in his pocket. "Karen," he said, "keep the broadcast running." "How long?" "Until they ask us to stop." He stood up and walked toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Get word to the habitats. Tell them it worked, all of it." George Ellison was in there somewhere, in one of those corridors, with his soil-stained hands and his steady eyes. "We are trusting you." He had tried to be worth it. The guard outside my door stepped aside without being asked when the administrative officer arrived. I had been in the holding room on Valarian Prime for 22 days. The room was clean. The cot was adequate. The meals were unfamiliar but sufficient. The window had given me something to look at during the long hours when the thinking I needed to do required a place for my eyes to rest that was not a wall. The communication terminal with its filtered galactic news access had provided reading material that had, over the past 6 days, become the most eventful and informative reading I had encountered in my professional life. The administrative officer was not security. He was a mid-level council functionary in a gray uniform, carrying a data tablet, with the manner of someone who has been told to be professionally courteous to a person whose status in the building has recently changed in ways the building's operational protocols have not fully processed yet. He told me my presence had been requested in the assembly chamber. I asked if I was formally being released. He said the question of my status was currently under review. I told him I would need a few minutes. He stepped back into the corridor and waited, and I appreciated that he did not argue about it. I took the small iron from its shelf near the window. They had brought it on my 3rd day in response to a politely worded request, which I had always thought said something revealing about the council bureaucracy's specific brand of thorough professionalism, even in adversarial circumstances. I pressed the worst of the wrinkles from my uniform. The navy blue was holding up well. The gold bars on my sleeves were untarnished. The earth crest on my left shoulder was clean. I checked my reflection in the window glass, made the small adjustments that needed making, and walked out of the room. The council building was the same physical space it had been when I first arrived. The pale composite corridors, the cool white lighting, the doorways scaled for species significantly taller than me, but the quality of the space was different in a way that was immediately, unmistakably felt. Staff moved through the corridors with the focused urgency of people managing a situation that was evolving faster than their existing procedures were built to accommodate. Conversations stopped when I passed and restarted at slightly different volumes. Eyes followed me with an expression I had seen on human faces many times but had not, until this week, encountered directed at a human being by members of another species. Not contempt, not the tolerant amusement of beings looking at something smaller than themselves, not even curiosity exactly. Careful, recalibrating attention. The kind that a person directs at someone who has become relevant in a way they had not previously expected. I let it pass without reaction and kept walking. The assembly chamber was full. Every seat was occupied, including the upper galleries that disappeared into artificial cloud. The display wall that had shown the voting results 22 days ago was now running the Earth habitat broadcast on a continuous loop. The corridors, the modules, the faces, 8 billion people alive in the tunnels beneath a planet that the Council had just formally reported it had successfully suppressed. Someone had made the decision to keep the broadcast running during the session. Whoever made that decision understood exactly what they were doing, reminding every delegate in the chamber, at regular intervals, of the specific gap between what the Council had declared and what the galaxy had seen. I was shown to a seat I had not occupied before, a proper delegate's position at a curved row near the front, with a name marker that read Earth Liaison in clean galactic standard lettering, a water glass, a communications terminal, the translation system speaker positioned precisely for the human auditory range. I sat down and looked around the chamber. In the rows of the 22 allied species, several delegates caught my eye as I settled into my seat. Small acknowledgments. The Talvath ambassador inclined his head precisely once, 3 rows back. A member of the Seraph delegation made the brief secondary appendage movement that I had been told their species used the way humans use a nod. These were not expressions of victory or celebration. They were the quiet signals that pass between people who have been working toward a shared outcome for a long time and have arrived at the moment where it might finally be achievable. The Grand Arbiter called the session to order. The 4 hours that followed were unlike anything I had attended in 6 months of Council sessions. The formal procedural tone was present. The Council never entirely abandoned it, even in a session this charged, but beneath it was something different. The atmosphere of a body trying to reckon honestly with a situation its existing frameworks had not been designed to address. Delegates spoke at length, some with genuine emotion I had not expected from species I had categorized as formally distant. Some with the cold, analytical precision that characterized the species whose internal governance was built on technical rather than representative structures. Some in combinations of both that required careful attention to read accurately. The Council's leadership faced a sustained, structured, and well-documented critique. The evidentiary basis for the Class Omega designation. The intelligence protocols that had failed to detect the habitat network's completion over 9 years of active deployment. The sensor assessment methodology that had reported occupied city targets at the moment of bombardment. The chain of authorization that had produced an order for corrective orbital enforcement against a civilian population that subsequent events had proven to be underground and entirely unharmed. The Talvath delegation gave the historical presentation. They had long memories and meticulous archives, and what they presented was a precise and unsparing chronological examination of all 11 prior suppression campaigns, the evidentiary basis for each designation, the adequacy or inadequacy of the review processes, the outcomes in terms of civilizational continuity for the species involved. 11 names, 11 civilizations. The final transmissions each had sent to the galactic record before the suppression operations concluded. Their histories preserved in Talvath archives because no one else had kept them. The chamber was very still during that presentation. When my turn came, I stood without notes, because the notes were inside me and had been for longer than I had been in this room. The events of the past 22 days are in the record. The broadcast this chamber has been watching documents the outcome. I am not here to restate what happened. I am here to present Earth's terms for the resolution of this conflict clearly and completely, and to say something about what those terms mean beyond the specific interests of my planet. I stated the three terms, each one directly, without attached justification. Permanent sovereignty guarantee for Earth and all human-settled worlds, binding under galactic law and non-revocable, without unanimous consent of the Security Directorate. Dissolution of the Class Omega designation system, effective immediately, pending a comprehensive review incorporating external validators from non-council species. A permanent seat on the Security Directorate, with full veto authority over any future suppression authorization order. The chamber was loud for several minutes after the third term. I waited. I had learned, across 6 months of sessions, that the chamber's noise was not something to compete with. It resolved on its own when it was ready. When it quieted enough, I continued. I want to speak to the third term specifically, because I recognize it will generate the most significant debate, and I want to be clear about what Earth is asking for and what it is not. I looked around at 217 species. At the ones who had voted yes 3 weeks ago, and the one who had voted no, and every degree of motivation and reluctance and genuine uncertainty that had existed between those two positions. Earth is not asking for authority over this institution. We are not asking for influence over trade designations, territorial matters, resource agreements, or any of the 1,000 other functions this council performs. We are asking for one thing, a voice that cannot be procedurally silenced in the specific decision of whether a civilization should be authorized for suppression. I paused for a moment. This council has suppressed 11 species, 11 civilizations that no longer exist because this body concluded, using a review process we now know was imperfect, that they represented threats requiring resolution by force. I am not standing in this chamber to assign personal responsibility to every delegate present for decisions made by predecessors in a system they inherited. Many of your species joined this institution after those events. Many of you have reservations about those histories that the existing procedures gave you no mechanism to express. I took a breath. But a system that can authorize the end of a civilization without any meaningful external check failed 11 times before it came for us. The only reason there is a 12th species standing in this chamber rather than in the Talvith archive is that we spent 40 years building the capacity to say no. Most species do not have 40 years of warning. Most species do not have the specific combination of resources and historical awareness that led us to spend 4 decades preparing for a moment we hoped would never come. I looked at the display wall where the habitat broadcast was still running on its continuous loop. A teacher somewhere in the Edinburgh sector, reading to 4 children. An elderly man looking directly into a camera with quiet, steady eyes. A permanent seat on the Security Directorate with veto authority over suppression orders means that the next species that receives a Class Omega designation cannot be acted upon without Earth's agreement. It means that before any civilization is targeted, someone in that room is required to ask the questions this process did not adequately ask for us. Is the evidence sufficient? Is the review process sound? Have all available alternatives been considered? Is this a decision that this institution will be able to defend to the galaxy in 50 years? Or 500. I looked back at the chamber. And if the answer to any of those questions is no, or insufficient, or inadequately documented, then the action does not proceed. Not permanently, not unconditionally, but not without those questions being answered satisfactorily, with a voice in the room that has the standing, the motivation, and the formal authority to ask them. I was quiet for a moment before the final part. I want to say one more thing. Earth spent 40 years preparing for this conflict. We built Thornwall. We constructed the habitat network. We developed intelligence access to this body's internal systems. We trained Vanguard Squadron. We cultivated relationships with 24 species that your leadership had been content to leave at the margins of this institution's power structure. We did all of that because we looked at your record and understood that we were going to end up in this chamber eventually, and we wanted to be ready. I let that sit. We could have used those same 40 years to build something different. If Earth had decided that the correct response to the possibility of galactic conflict was maximum offensive capability, we could have arrived in this solar system last month with a fleet to rival yours. We had the industrial capacity. We had the scientific foundation. We chose not to, not because we lacked the ability. Because we looked at the history of what unchecked military power produces over 14,000 years, and concluded that replacing one version of it with another was not a victory worth having. I looked at the Grand Arbiter directly. What we built instead was a defense that worked, a deception that succeeded, and a set of political relationships that are positioned, right now, to change how this institution makes its most consequential decisions. That is what 40 years of preparation produced. Not weapons. Influence. The kind that operates through institutions and lasts longer than any fleet. I sat down. The debate ran for 3 more hours. I will not describe all of it. It is in the full session record and will be studied by political historians for longer than I will be alive. What I will note is that the tone shifted at a specific moment, approximately 2 hours in, when the Seraph delegation's senior speaker, an elderly being whose species communicated partly through subsonic frequencies, the translation bead rendered as a low accompanying hum, said simply that it had been a member of this council for 60 years, that the names in the Talvath archive had always troubled it, and that a system which had produced 11 outcomes like those deserved to be examined by someone with both the standing and the motivation to examine it honestly. The chamber was quiet after that for nearly a full minute. The vote was called following the 3rd hour of debate. I watched the display board. 189 green lights, 28 red. Earth's terms were accepted in full. The Class Omega designation system was suspended pending comprehensive review. The commission for the prior campaigns was formally constituted. The censure resolution against the Council's current leadership passed in the subsequent motion. And on the delegate display wall, added beside the markers of 217 other species listed in their galactic standard alphabetical order, a new marker appeared. Earth. I sat in the delegate's chair and looked at it. Just a marker, just a name in a list, the smallest possible visible sign of a 40-year project reaching the first of its outcomes. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out of the assembly chamber. The plaza outside was wide and open, paved in something that felt like stone but held a residual warmth. Velarion's sky was doing the late-day thing it does, amber at the horizon, deep blue overhead, 2 different qualities of light meeting in the middle in a way that was genuinely beautiful and completely indifferent to the fact that inside the building I had just left, something that had not existed an hour ago now did. I stood in the plaza and breathed the copper-end sweet air that would never smell like anything on Earth and probably should not. My communicator buzzed. Webb. How did it go? I thought about the answer for a moment. I thought about Claire Madden, whose hands never shook, who had placed 4 charges on a 2-kilometer warship in 90 seconds of real time after 430 simulations, and had flown away without looking back. I thought about Yusuf, who had spent 30 years reading the enemy's history to find the one structural gap in 14,000 years of victories, and had found it and built the entire response around it. I thought about Corinne Aldridge and the 2-year-long preparation of a broadcast that had to reach the entire galaxy at precisely the right moment, and had reached it within 88 seconds of the projected window. I thought about 8 billion people who had spent days in tunnels and sealed rooms trusting a plan they had not been fully briefed on. Because sometimes trust is the thing you offer when verification is not possible. I thought about George Ellison, the soil under his fingernails, the steady eyes. "We are trusting you." I typed 3 words. "Same as always." I sent it and put the communicator in my pocket. The Talvith ambassador from the session came through the chamber doors behind me and stopped near my left shoulder. It was a tall being, dark-feathered, with bright horizontal eyes that caught the amber of the late sky. "Your species," it said, in the precise galactic standard that the translation bead rendered in a voice like dry paper, "is very difficult to model accurately." "We have been told that before," I said. "The archive will include today's session in the record of the 11 campaigns. As a resolution." It paused, the first entry of that kind in the record. I looked at the sky. "That was the point," I said. It inclined its head once and walked on. I stayed in the plaza for a while longer. I thought about what came next, the diplomatic work of making the directorate seat real rather than nominal, the Commission's examination of the 11 prior campaigns, the careful maintenance of the political relationships that had produced 189 votes, where the minimum had been 145. I thought about the fact that the work was not finished, that work of this kind is never finished, that the seat in the directorate room was not a destination but a starting position. 6 months later, Earth tabled the resolution on the 11 prior suppression campaigns, the formal acknowledgement of each species by name, the commitment to preserve their recorded histories in a permanent archive accessible to all member species, the establishment of memorial records, a statement of institutional responsibility that did not assign guilt to current delegates but did not soften the history. The session ran long. Several delegates argued that retrospective acknowledgement served no constructive purpose, that what had happened could not be changed by language in a document, that the Council's function was the present and future governance of the galactic community, and not the re-examination of decisions made under different circumstances by previous leadership. The Talvith delegation made the counterargument. They made it in the detailed, patient, historically precise way that species with long memories and meticulous archives make arguments, drawing on the record they had maintained across 14,000 years, and it was one of the finest pieces of institutional reasoning I have heard in any chamber on any planet. The vote was called. The resolution passed unanimously. Every species in that chamber voted yes, including the species whose predecessors had participated in those prior campaigns, including the ones who had voted 217 to 1 to authorize Earth suppression 23 months before. Every light on the board went green, one by one, until the display was a single unbroken field of the same color. I was in the room for that vote. I sat in the delegate's chair with the Earth marker on the display wall beside me, and I watched every light appear. I did not smile. It was not a moment for smiling. It was a moment for sitting quietly with what had happened and what it meant, for thinking about the 11 names in the archive and the civilizations they represented, the ones who had sat in chambers like this one and made their final appeals and been suppressed anyway, whose histories the Talvith had preserved because no one else had thought to, and because long-memoried species understand something about loss that shorter-memoried ones sometimes miss, that the things you lose do not stop being real because they are gone, for thinking about what it means to be the last thing standing after something has tried seriously to end you, for thinking about what you owe to the ones who did not survive, and whether unanimous votes in grand chambers constitute the right currency for that debt, and whether they are sufficient, or whether they are simply the floor, the minimum below which nothing can honestly be called good, and not the ceiling of what remains possible. I sat in my delegate's chair in a hall built for 1,000 species, watching the display board go completely green, and I thought, we did not win this because we were more powerful. We were not. We won it because we refused to let them define the terms of the fight. We refused to match their timeline, accept their framing, or behave the way their doctrine predicted we would. We built our response entirely around the single place where 14,000 years of perfect victories had produced a gap, and we built it over 4 decades with patience and precision, and the specific human quality that their models had no category for. And then we used the space that survival created not to accumulate power, but to build something that would outlast the moment that made it necessary. The chair, the name on the wall, a voice in the room where the decisions that matter most get made, a voice that will ask the right questions before the authorizations go through, that cannot be procedurally overridden, that will be sitting in that room long after everyone currently in this chamber is gone. That was what the word had meant, the one I had sent in a fraction of a second from the assembly chamber on the day of the vote, before the jamming activated. Saber. Not a weapon. A key. To the room where it would never happen again. That was the victory that 40 years of preparation had been aimed at, from the beginning, before any of us who carried it forward knew exactly what shape it would take when it arrived. The board stayed green. Same as always.